Likewise, and firstly, thank you very much to you, Wes, and to the American Society of International Law for this opportunity. I'm very honoured on behalf of the International Committee of the Red Cross to be able to moderate this panel, and I'm greatly looking forward to the following hour. Just to set the scene, over the last 20 years, the US military and organisations like the International Committee of the Red Cross and civilians in armed conflict and others have been actively engaged in working on civilian harm, prevention and mitigation measures in conflicts that have been broadly characterised as counterinsurgency operations or low-intensity conflicts. What we see now with the ongoing drawdown of US forces from operations abroad and a new focus on the preparation for the potential of large-scale combat operations with a possible near-peer adversary, which has been highlighted by the 2018 US National Defence Strategy. Now is really the right time, for all of us to get together and consider some of the hard-won lessons on civilian protection and CivCAS prevention and mitigation over the last few decades, and then start to consider how that experience might be applied in future conflicts that may differ greatly in the scale, speed and intensity of what we might have previously seen. We have a fantastic breadth of experience and knowledge on this panel. I'm thrilled to see it. We have, perspectives that represent not just the law, but the policy and I think what's critical, the application of both on the ground. We're very fortunate to have, first off, Butch Bracknell. Butch is currently the Staff Legal Advisor of International Law at NATO's Headquarters Supreme Allied Commander Transformation in Norfolk, Virginia. He's a retired Marine JAG lawyer, as well as being an armor officer, so it brings that unique perspective of both law and operations. And he's a member of the Truman National Society Security Projects Defense Council. He's a graduate of the University of Virginia's Sorensen Institute for Political Leadership and a fellow with the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. A graduate of the Harvard Law School, the University of Maryland School of Law, the University of North Carolina, and if I am correct, is just finishing up or may have just finished up further legal studies at the Oxford University's Faculty of Law. Alongside Butch, we have Professor Mitt Regan. Mitt, who's just come online, is the McDevitt Professor of Jurisprudence. He's the Director of the Centre on Ethics and the Legal Profession and Co-Director of the Centre on National Security and the Law at Georgetown University Law Centre. He's also an academic visitor at the UAERO Centre for Applied Ethics at the University of Oxford and serves as a Senior Fellow at the Stockdale Centre for Ethical Leadership at the US Naval Academy. Mitt's research and teaching focuses on ethical issues in the context of national security, human rights, and the military and legal professions. His publications draw on multiple disciplines that include organisational and behavioural psychology, the sociology of organisations, neuroscience research and on moral perception, deliberation and judgment, as well as moral philosophy. He's currently the senior researcher on a European Research Council advanced grant project focusing on global terrorism and collective moral responsibility. So very, very privileged to have both Mitt and Butch with us. And of course, our third panelist, Annie Shiel, who's just coming online now. Annie is a senior advisor, or the senior advisor for US policy and advocacy with the Center for Civilians in Conflict, and a research program manager with Stanford University, where she conducts research, advocacy, and coalition building around US civilian harm policies and emerging civilian protection challenges. Prior to working with Civic, with civilians in conflict, she spent 3 years at the US State Department working on human rights, civilian protection, and security sector reform as a founding member of the DRL's Office of Security and Human Rights. She's a Truman National Security Fellow and holds a Master of International Policy from Stanford University, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in International Development from McGill University. So we can already see that there is a great complementarity of experience and perspectives here on this panel, which I think is really going to feed further discussion, fruitful discussion at the moment. I know that you don't want to hear necessarily need to hear more from me. You'd rather hear from the panel members. So let's just touch on the fact that I think the breadth of experience is going to be hugely useful. We have Butch's perspective as a combat arms officer and as a JAG, looking at how to make LOAC operational on the ground for the military, which is something I know he's actively involved in now in his work with Nato. We have Mitt's perspective as an eminent legal scholar, which provides a unique view, and I'm particularly interested in your background, Mitt, in organisational and behavioural psychology and how that might inflect some of our thinking. And then we have Annie's perspective from Civic, an organisation that has done outstanding work in wrestling with how militaries can practically implement CivCas, civilian casualty mitigation policies in conflict. I've witnessed Civic's work in Afghanistan and Ukraine, and I think it's an organisation that truly understands the realities on the ground and has a laser focus on making those measures practically work. Just to cover off, again, as Wes noted, you are more than welcome to input your questions into the Q&A function. We will try to deal with them as we go along where we can, but we do have some time reserved at the end for a sort of a plenary session. So to move straight into it, I'd like to get Butch's initial perspectives as a lawyer working in NATO at the moment. I'd like to get your thoughts on how the US and NATO are looking at, civilian protection whilst, potentially fighting in an urban environment. I know that this is something that occupies your thoughts, and I'd be interested to get your perspective on, how from a doctrine, planning and operational perspective, both NATO and the US are approaching civilian mitigation, avoidance, prevention, in what may be a large-scale combat operation in an urban environment. So, Butch, I will throw it over to you, and looking forward to hearing from your perspective. Butch, I think we may still have you on mute. We might be having a few technical dramas with Butch. So while we try and sort that out, Mitt, I might just throw to you now just to see whether you could share your perspective. When we think about fighting in the urban environment, when we think about near peer conflict, large scale combat operations in that kind of environment, one of the things that strikes us is the concept of the principle of feasible precautions and how they might work in that sort of environment. What are your thoughts on that? Where do you see precautions fitting into sort of the targeting cycle, into the operational cycle, and how does it link with the principles of distinction and proportionality? I'd invite you to share your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Michael. It's a real pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel. I want to offer a perspective that's based on my good fortune in being able to interact regularly with both members of the military, especially JAGs, and with human rights groups. And I want to draw on some of the research on organizational behavior and culture and how certain values become embedded in culture as a daily guide to people's behavior. So let me start first with focusing on the two kinds of conflicts that are the focus of this panel today. I think they raise especially acute challenges in attempting to protect innocent civilians. First, many knowledgeable observers project that a large percentage of future hostilities will occur in urban settings. That has been the trend, and it's likely to continue for a variety of reasons. We also know that an increasing percentage of armed conflicts today are non-international armed conflicts, right? That means that a substantial portion of hostilities will be between states and non-state actors embedded within the urban civilian population. Second, with respect to near-peer competition. Now that conjures up the notion of a 21st century Fulda gap, right? Where large contingents of armed forces of each state are arrayed against one another. But I think many observers suggest that near-peer competition will take substantially the form of hostilities between proxy forces. And we're seeing this already increasing, or between proxy forces and state forces. So these kinds of conflicts will, I think, pose the same challenge in differentiating persons engaged in hostilities and those who are not. So I think it's fair to say that civilians will continue to be at substantial risk when hostilities occur in the near future. And forces are going to face demanding conditions in attempting to avoid and minimize civilian human casualties by civilians. A NATO paper on operationalizing protection of civilians in NATO operations, with which I'm sure Butch is familiar, says, quote, "Civilian protection is first and foremost about creating a mindset," close quote. In other words, in addition to policies, directives, tactics, techniques, and procedures, it's important for armed forces to establish a culture that emphasizes the importance of civilian protection. And the Department of Defense in the US is taking steps, I think, to do this. It now submits an annual report on civilian casualties in connection with US military operations. It's established an office headed by a senior civilian official who's the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy to develop and coordinate and oversee compliance with the policy of the department relating to civilian casualties. And that office is currently engaged in preparing that policy for publication. And these are important steps, but they have to have an impact, as we all know, down the chain of command to units in the field. And this is a challenge for any organization, how to embed values all the way down. But especially for one such as the military, in which there are a wide range of different kinds of forces dispersed around the globe, who are often called to make decisions with imperfect information under highly stressful conditions. How can the department embed a culture of civilian protection in light of these on-the-ground realities? I want to discuss one step that I think could help do this. And this is for militaries to give predominant emphasis to the principle of precaution under the law of armed conflict, or LOAC, while of course continuing to recognize the importance of complying with the principles of necessity, distinction, and proportionality. Right? What I'm talking about is a slight, subtle, but I think important shift in emphasis. Now, the principle of precaution requires all forces to take all feasible precautions to avoid or minimize harm to innocent civilians. The principles of distinction and proportionality, as many members of our audience know, are regarded as cornerstones of the attempt by LOAC to avoid and reduce the amount of harm to innocent civilians. The principle of distinction, of course, says that only combatants may be intentionally attacked. Proportionality says that any expected civilian harm must not be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage from an attack. The principle of precaution, however, does not always receive the attention it deserves. Many JAGs with whom I've spoken tell me that the principles of distinction and proportionality are always front and center in conversations with commanding officers. they make clear that these conversations also involve a discussion of feasible precautions. Right? But those discussions sometimes occur after a determination that civilian casualties will not be excessive under the principle of proportionality. In other words, rather late in the targeting cycle. The distinction of proportionality also receives prominent attention in the DoD Law of War Manual, both distinction and proportionality, with a section devoted to each. The discussion of precautions, however, is included within the discussion of proportionality. And again, this could be read to indicate that the duty to take precautions is triggered after a target's been selected, right, and a collateral damage estimate has been conducted, right? That approach is inconsistent with Article 57 of Additional Protocol 1, which calls upon precautions in attack and for militaries to take constant care to spare the civilian population, civilians, and civilian objects. As several commentators have noted, this imposes an ongoing obligation to minimize harm to civilians throughout operations in the targeting cycle. And Article 52 goes on to underscore this by requiring that feasible precautions be taken in determining that targets are military objectives, that is, in applying with conforming to the principle of distinction, choosing means and methods of attack with a view to avoiding or minimizing harm to civilians, and refraining from launching any attack that'll produce excessive civilian casualties compared to anticipated military advantage. In other words, in complying with the principle of proportionality. Now, I hasten to add that notwithstanding the placement of precautions under proportionality in the Law of War Manual, that manual contains several excellent examples of steps that are consistent with the broader understanding of the obligation that I've described here under Article 57. And I'm not suggesting that analysis of feasibility gets short shrift, but if the aim is to embed a culture of civilian protection in forces that have to make rapid decisions, it's important to think about what principle is it going to come first to mind to someone in those conditions automatically as an overarching touchstone for the decision-making process. Right? It's clear that in other kind of organizational context, things like a slogan or a motto or something that serves as an insistent reminder that's top of mind can be a powerful way of shaping behavior. And in subtle ways, I think that maybe precaution is the principle that ought to serve this purpose. So why is that? Well, the obligation, when you think about it, to take feasible precautions is a duty to continuously seek out and evaluate reasonably available information that helps ensure compliance with the principles of both distinction and proportionality. In this respect, it's an overarching obligation, not one that's distinct from the other two. In other words, an armed force that conscientiously abides by the obligation to take feasible precautions will, as a consequence, almost certainly abide by the principles of distinction and proportionality. With respect to discrimination, for instance, taking all feasible precautions to avoid civilian harm means continuously gathering and assessing information that enables a force to characterize an individual as a combatant or a non-combatant, or as directly participating in hostilities or not. With respect to proportionality, Jeff Korn has suggested that all feasible precautionary measures should be evaluated with respect to each potential course of action before a proportionality assessment. This will ensure that the latter assessment is based on a prior concrete determination of how civilian harm can be reduced as a practical matter. By contrast, he suggests, beginning with proportionality means engaging in the more speculative process of trying to assign a weight to inherently incommensurable values, the ultimate comparison of apples and oranges, to determine if civilian casualties are likely to be excessive. Now, the US military and other military advanced militaries, I think, honor all of these principles: discrimination, proportionality, and the duty to take feasible precautions. But for the reasons I've suggested, I think a subtle shift in emphasis to place precautions in the forefront could be a way of providing guidance on fulfilling the other two obligations that is especially operationally meaningful. If this principle is seen as an overarching principle, compliance with discrimination and proportionality is likely to follow. I just want to close by suggesting that emphasizing precautions might also serve another purpose, right? And that is to help bridge the gap between the US military and those who criticize it for not sufficiently taking the need to protect civilians into account in its operations. As we know, this kind of criticism can impair perceptions of the legitimacy of the use of force by military forces. It can undermine their potential strategic advantage in the international community that rests on a commitment to the rule of law and belief in the inherent value of each individual. The military with which I'm most familiar, the US military, rightfully prides itself on adherence to law, and therefore sometimes responds to these criticisms by saying that critics have the mistaken view that LOAC prohibits civilian casualties, when in fact it actually permits them as long as they're not excessive, right? But then critics respond, and then the military suggests critics have a mistaken view of the law, right? Or they're trying to hold the US to a more demanding standard than the law requires, right? And this is true, but it doesn't always satisfy the critics, right? Some respond that avoiding only those civilian casualties that are excessive reflects insensitivities to civilian lives. They say a sophisticated, technologically advanced military has the capability to do more than this, and this should be the standard by which it's judged, right? This can be frustrating for the military, for whom compliance with law is a bedrock principle. As General Petey and Laura Dickinson mentioned in the previous panel in this series, some criticism reflects the fact that the US does sometimes adopt more demanding standards for use of force as a matter of policy rather than law. And some in the international community may use this as a standard that applies to all US military operations, instead of realizing that it applies only in particular situations. This is where I think the US could help address concerns about legitimacy by emphasizing that compliance with LOAC does not simply mean ensuring that civilian casualties are not excessive. It also means taking all feasible precautions to avoid or minimize civilian casualties. So when the US or another military says an operation complied with LOAC, it's saying that it complied with the obligation to take all feasible precautions. And this is consistent with the claim that what precautions are feasible necessarily takes into account what a technologically advanced military can do. So this, I think, would be responsive to the claim that the US and other armed forces must draw on their sophisticated resources to limit civilian casualties as much as possible. To say that an operation complied with LOAC means that the force did exactly that. So I think that emphasizing this point, and to the extent possible, describing precautions that were taken, could go a long way to assuring critics that when the US and other forces operate under LOAC, it does take civilian protection seriously. There may continue to be disagreement about whether civilian casualties from a particular operation were acceptable, but the approach I suggest would highlight that this disagreement is over what precautions were feasible. In sum, a shifting emphasis to the principle of precaution in conducting operations under LOAC as the touchstone that comes to mind for operations, I think could have two benefits. First of all, it could provide a standard for decision-making that could enhance civilian protection, while almost automatically satisfying the principles of distinction and proportionality. Second, it could clarify that U.S. military emphasis and other forces' emphasis on compliance with LOAC necessarily means taking respect for human life, because it involves taking all feasible precautions to protect it. Thank you. I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mitt. I mean, a fascinating, great way to get things started, and a fascinating perspective. One that looks at the international humanitarian law principles and sort of identifies precautions perhaps as being undervalued and the first among equals. And I think it makes natural sense to ask Butch as somebody who grapples with both the law and policy angles of this, his perspective on that. Just to summarise some of the points that jumped out at me that you made was certainly initially something that the ICRC also observes. A proliferation of non-state armed groups and non-international armed conflicts around the world, increasing urbanisation. We have a prediction that 70% of the world's population will be living in an urban environment by 2050. So future conflicts will almost inevitably be fought in cities and possibly even in mega cities. And those are extremely demanding conditions in which to conduct hostilities. I really enjoyed, and I think Annie will have something to add to this too, the idea that civilian protection needs to be a mindset. It's a culture that's set, and that it needs to for it to be effective, it needs to translate all the way down the chain, and that one of the issues that you feel is that often feasible precautions are perhaps identified too late or thought about too late in the whole process. So I think Butch would have an interesting perspective to share, particularly because he's actively involved in some of the Nato Capstone documents that deal with civilian protection and large-scale combat operations in urban environments. I'd love to get your thoughts, Butch, about how do we set a culture of civilian protection within an armed force, particularly keeping in mind Lieutenant General Petty's comments last week about, in potential near-peer conflict, there may not be a legal advisor or a JAG immediately available, that decision-making will be pushed down to a relatively tactical level. You'll have people making decisions that will involve international humanitarian law. Consequences may be very severe, but they may not have that legal support that commanders have become used to over the last sort of 20 years. And then, the point that Mick looked at where, is there a difference between law and policy? How would that change in a future conflict? And your thoughts on how we might best go about picking up what are the feasible precautions that commanders need to take into account, in a large-scale combat operation in an urban environment. Butch, I'll throw it to you, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
I'd like to. Hey, can you hear me, Mike? We good?
Sure can. Yep.
Yeah, great. So I'd like to think that we planned this out to mesh this really perfectly, but I know that it's really kind of fortuitous, and it may be fortuitous because all these good ideas just kind of naturally mesh together here. I take Mitt's point 100% about the issue about taking feasible precautions. So I'm gonna make these comments as a retired U.S. Marine Lieutenant Colonel before I get into put on my NATO hat, and this is one of my experiences as a Marine on active duty. The feasible precautions we're probably a generation away from that. That has never been part of the U.S. training mindset since time immemorial. Since I first started learning about the law of armed conflict, I was probably at Harvard getting my LLM before I ever heard about the concept of feasible precautions. And I went, well, there's a useful concept, but it had never been part of the training curriculum for the U.S. forces up until there. So you've got a lot of battalion and brigade and division commanders out there for whom feasible precautions is also not. They know you describe distinction to them. They can They can get their heads around that. You describe proportionality to them, they can get their heads around that. But this idea of physical precautions, it is just not, as Mitt notes, it has just not been, as Mitt alluded to. I thought the perfect thing was when he was talking about the structure of the Duty Law of War Manual, it's as though it is a concept that's wrapped in the others as opposed to one that has intellectual merit of its own. So I really do, to say, I don't want to be pessimistic and say it'll be a whole generation, but I do think that we need to introduce the idea now and have it work its way into US in particular training, so that 15 years from now, it becomes more as much of a norm as those other norms are. I also take General Petey's point about near peer. We did get a little spoiled by the U.S. experience in particular in Iraq and Afghanistan, where you had judge advocates advising commanders all the way down to the battalion level. That will probably never happen again. In the Marine Corps' table of organization, we have no legal advisors assigned below the division and air wing levels. So below that, you would have, if the division were in combat in the Marine Corps anyway, and I think the Army probably has them at the brigade combat team level, but still brigade's pretty far above a company. So the saturation of legal advice is going to be more attenuated than it has been over the past 20 years since we've been putting Marine judge advocate, usually captains, in with infantry battalions that were in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I take his point, and the answer there is when the legal advice is at the 2-star level and above, is going to come down to training, doctrine, and the way we organize, and the concepts which feed our operational planning, which, as I said, we couldn't have planned this any better. What I wanted to talk about was a couple of concepts that Nato, that my headquarters SecD, where I've been the legal advisor advising on 2 separate capstone concepts that have come through headquarters SecD over the past 2 years. The first is the concept for protection of civilians, MC0668, if anybody's taking notes, MC0668. It was endorsed by the Military Committee on 25 April 18. Endorsed by the Military Committee basically means that it has the imprimatur of the nations, that we have unanimous, that we have consensus that this concept represents the nation's thinking on that particular issue. And the second concept is the NATO Capstone concept, which came after it about a year. The NATO Joint Military Operations in an Urban Environment, which was accepted by the Military Committee on 11 March 2019. I'm working to get those publicly released. NATO unclassified documents, even though they're unclassified, are still not distributable to the general public unless a decision has been taken to make them so. I'm working on that, and Mike and Keith, if I can get those things cleared for public release, I'll send those along to you, and you can make them available as a resource for participants in this conference. So what's the difference between a concept and a capstone concept? I have no idea. They really both serve, they're just labels. They both serve the same purpose as framing documents for development of capabilities, doctrine, training, exercises, operational planning, interoperability, material organization, all the things that we at Headquarters SecT hold dear in our mission as a transformational command, meaning a futures command, which is intended to help shape and the nations anticipate the nature of conflict and how we will equip and organize and train and exercise over the next 20, 30, 40 years. So let me talk about the protection of civilians concept first. Our headquarters is particularly proud of this concept, and only 24 pages, we've managed to capture some pretty important ideas, I think. So it consists of an overarching idea plus 3 elements. The first principle is understanding the human environment. Who are the actors in the joint operating environment? What are their interests? Who are we fighting? Who are we protecting? And who are we doing neither for? Who are we neither fighting nor protecting? Who are just bystanders in the joint operating area, and what are our obligations to them? We have managed to organize that along 3 lines of effort or elements. The 3 lines of effort are mitigate harm, facilitate access to basic needs, and contribute to a safe and secure environment. Okay, mitigate harm. This is the obvious gravamen for the application of law of armed conflict, right? But it isn't LOAC only. As Mitt sort of alluded to, LOAC becomes the baseline for mitigate harm. It becomes the minimum standard for compliance. But NATO's position has been, hey, in this era of conflict and warfare, we could do better than that. And maybe we should do better than that. And very often there are good policy and military reasons for doing better than mere compliance. And I use that term with a little bit of a sneer in my voice of mere compliance, because as Mitt alluded to earlier, mere compliance is a pretty low bar in a lot of circumstances. And as Western alliances should probably strive to do better than that. Mission dependent, of course. Sometimes mere compliance might be just the best you can do in a particular operational scenario, but we ought to be striving for better than mere compliance. The second line is facilitating access to basic needs, not necessarily NATO providing or NATO nations providing these basic needs, but making provisions of basic needs possible. And here's where our tie-in and our interaction with the IO and NGO community is really, really important. And the third is contributing to a safe and secure environment. Sometimes we provide the security, sometimes we make it possible for the host nation, for the site of the conflict, for their security forces to get back on their feet, provide security. Sometimes we're just enablers for their police and security forces. Sometimes it's a national task with NATO support. And again, here, the IO and NGO community are very, very essential. Principles and considerations. We look at it as a very comprehensive concept. And to Mitt's point, we look at it as a core military function. This is no longer a nice to have. This is not the cherry on top of the ice cream sundae. This is an integral ingredient in the sundae of NATO military operations, regardless whether it's irregular warfare, whether it is security stability operations, all the way up to high intensity, pure state conflict. Very focused on population-centric point of views, and we view it as a moral obligation. To the extent that moral obligations and legal obligations are a Venn diagram, we look at those circles. They can go back and forth, right? But we like to live in the sweet spot of the overlap between the moral obligation and the legal obligation, understanding that quite often the moral obligation can exceed the legal obligation. Back to the issue that Mitt highlighted about mere compliance. Now, since I don't want to run over and dominate the time, let me move quickly to the joint military operations and urban environment concept. A second operation concept, since we're talking about civilian casualties and particularly looking at urban environments, if you read these two concepts together, and it's our design that they'll influence other strategic level documents that come out of NATO that give our operational forces guidance on how to plan, but we don't look at these as constraints. We look at them as tools that operational planners using the comprehensive operational planning directive, the shape operational planning process, is that they'll use these tools as resources to help them understand and frame military problems and break down their military missions and assign units tasks. So the urban operating environment in particular has to be understood as a dynamic, open, and complex system of systems. There are dedicated paragraphs inside this concept, which is double. It's 50 pages. It's about twice as big as the protection of civilians concept. And there are dedicated paragraphs in there about the operational and legal constraints, about the legal environment for urban operations. The use of force. One key quote that I really like, and I may like it because I wrote it, that the use of force can be considered not only through military and legal compliance lenses, but all through the lens of the enemy's potential to manipulate public perception of that use of force. And an adversary may manipulate that perception to its advantage and to the detriment of NATO. That is sort of a lawfare / counter lawfare idea that we've been trying to weave into here that makes law a really important law, compliance with law, doing better than the compliance with law, countering the adversary's misuse of law as really important tools for strategists to think about and operational planners to think about. It is no longer just force on force, but will on will, and the enemy's manipulation of perceptions of our compliance with the law of armed conflict can be absolutely strategically debilitating, even if we are fully compliant in every way. None of that matters. What matters is how people perceive our actions. And the adversaries have been very good at manipulating that. And we are getting smarter now about recognizing that as a tool that they employ and working to counter that. So I could go on and say more, but I will close down there. I hope I'm still inside time limits. But Mitt, I appreciate your comments. It was almost as though we had coordinated in order to make those two things go together. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here and to answer questions as they arise. Thank you, Mike.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Butch, and you kept perfectly to time. Look, thank you very much for that candid operator's perspective. I think it was hugely useful, especially, yes, it seems like you're in wonderful concert with MIT, particularly when we talk about feasible precautions. You know, that frank assessment that many commanders during your career have probably perhaps not paid sufficient attention to that, and that is something that needs to be highlighted. Was hugely useful, and also interesting to hear that the way that you're approaching things is that mere IHL compliance is perhaps the minimum standard. You would be shooting for higher than that. But what particularly grabbed my attention, and I think will work really well for Annie's comments, was the Capstone concept around the urban environment, which you described as being dynamic, by being composed of dynamic, complex systems. And this is something that occupies the minds of many humanitarian organisations when they look at a city. It's not just buildings and people, it's infrastructure and systems that are all interlinked and interwoven. And the reverberating consequences from operations in an urban environment can have many significant consequences to the civilian population and need to be factored into those feasible precautions that militaries need to take. And I think, Annie, you've got a perspective to share where, when we look forward into the potential for large-scale combat operations in urban environments, where do you think there might be gaps in the kind of current policy and the current approach, and what do you think should occupy the minds of people writing doctrine, people planning exercise, people preparing for the possibility that they may be fighting in a dense urban environment? I welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much for a perfect introduction to what I love to talk about. And thank you again so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. I'll start by saying that I am not a lawyer. And so what I hope to bring to this conversation is really a civilian-centered focus on the observed impacts of conflict on civilians and what that tells us about shortcomings in policy and practice, and at times law, whether interpretation or adherence to the law. And given my work at Civic's US program, my comments will be largely focused on US conduct and policy, but hopefully applicable to other contexts as well. So in keeping with the theme of today's panel, I do want to focus on two issues where I think the impact on civilians is devastating, and yet where policy, practice, and adherence to the law have been or may in the future be insufficient to address that harm. So the first one is civilian harm in urban operations, because this is a quote unquote next generation issue where we don't have to guess what it might look like. It's a current and pressing problem, but one that will become more prominent as cities get more dense and as conflict continues to move to populated areas. And specifically, I like to focus on reverberating effects of conflict. So we tend to focus on the direct civilian casualties in conflict for obviously many very good reasons. But another huge area of concern is the damage to civilian objects, which include critical infrastructure, and then the resulting reverberating or indirect or knockoff harms that come from that damage and destruction. Those are really wide-reaching and across almost every conflict outnumber direct civilian casualties. So examples of those include the destruction of hospitals, schools, electrical grids, water infrastructure, agriculture, businesses, attacks on essential workers, aid workers, all of which can lead to interrupted or restricted service delivery, including the delivery of healthcare, clean water, disease outbreaks and other public health emergencies, food insecurity, displacement, including the inability to return after conflict because of this harm or damage, and loss of livelihoods and other economic losses, and then of course trauma and long-term mental health impacts on populations. So these are enormously wide-ranging harms. A really common example is in Yemen, where the cholera epidemic has certainly been fueled by the Saudi-led coalition's strikes on water infrastructure, as well as hospitals. But these are things that really we've seen across the board, including conflicts in Iraq, in Syria, Ukraine, Somalia, really you name it. And I think that the US and partnered operations in Mosul and Raqqa have really brought this issue to the forefront for those who focus on civilian protection, and has demonstrated that regardless of intent, the US military and others, I think, clearly lack the policy, doctrine, planning, practices, sometimes knowledge that's required to prevent this kind of reverberating harm, especially as the use of explosive weapons in populated areas becomes, I think, a really tragic norm. And part of that is, current civilian harm mitigation processes, such as collateral damage estimation and then post-strike assessments, are generally focused by design on direct impact, on direct civilian harm, civilian casualties, and immediate impact on buildings, on civilian objects. And don't, in my experience, tend to focus on those wider ranging reverberating impacts that may even be felt, in a different place than where the strike happens, right? So if a strike happens in one area that is a source of food for another city, there are impacts in that other city as well. So from a policy perspective, I think Mitt mentioned the forthcoming policy, the DoD policy on civilian harm, the first comprehensive policy on civilian harm. And so as we've been, pushing for a number of really important areas of focus in that policy, one thing that we have been pushing for is a systematic approach to preventing and addressing not just direct civilian harm, but also reverberating civilian harms that arise from the damage and destruction of civilian objects throughout the targeting cycle. So that means developing the means and processes to comprehensively understand the significance of civilian objects in relation to civilian life. This bridge, this hospital, this hospital is maybe not the perfect example, but this water infrastructure, how many people do they serve? What areas are they serving? Obviously, under IHL, those are not going to be targeted. However, they are frequently damaged or destroyed as collateral damage. Number two, how do you evaluate and integrate potential reverberating effects during the planning process, during intelligence preparation? And then how do you, during target development, use that information to anticipate and prevent reverberating harms? How do you, after the fact, assess observed harm, both direct and indirect, and learn from that harm? And then how do you include damage to civilian objects in your policies on post-harm amends, on how you address harm that's occurred? And then, of course, there is an ongoing international political process on stopping the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, where I think it's also really important for the US to be on board. And so as a non-lawyer, from a legal perspective, one question that I would have for the lawyers here would be, under IHL, how must proportionality assessments consider the entirety, the totality of impact, to include both the cumulative impact of individual strikes? So, we've seen in places like Mosul, the use of precision weapons, but if you use a precision weapon to take out every floor of a building or every building in a city, is that the city is still flattened? So what is the assessment there? And then similarly with indirect effects, how do you include potential reverberating effects in a proportionality assessment, since the civilians in that building are not the only civilians who will be harmed by a strike? So, we can't, I think the other question I have is we can't unsee what we've observed in Mosul and Raqqa and Yemen and beyond. And so we know that those reverberating harms are extraordinarily real and devastating. So given that knowledge, what is the responsibility to act to reduce harm? So I want to touch really briefly on a second issue. So kind of zooming out to the entire future of potential near-peer conflict and great power conflict. I'll also just touch briefly on some work that Civic has done there, and then I'll stop. But obviously we've seen, as others have touched on, a shift I'll speak to the US military in particular, a shift from a focus on counterterrorism to a focus on great power conflict. And from Civic's perspective and others that we've spoken to, with that shift, we've noted a decline or a lack of focus on the protection of civilians in planning, perhaps because the strategic imperatives to, win hearts and minds, quote unquote, is less obvious in such a conflict. But we have been undertaking research around this with Stanford University and with Naval War College to better understand the potential risks to civilians in a variety of great power conflict scenarios, which again are wide ranging from gray zone conflict to large scale combat operations, and then to communicate those risks to policymakers and planners. In the interest of time, happy to take questions on this, but I'll just focus on my perhaps more controversial comment on this topic. So of course, we're working as we do this research to ensure that civilian considerations are embedded into planning for all types of conflict, and that is absolutely essential. But I will say that I think as we've been doing this work, it's really important, I think, to recognize the enormous likely human costs of great power conflict and to communicate those at the political level, right? So I recognize that, of course, for an enormous host of reasons, the humanitarian community, the protection of civilians community focuses on conduct of conflict once it begins. But I do think that for organizations that can be more forward-leaning on decisions to use force at all, it is important to ensure that even as we engage in these really important conversations around planning and preparation and specific civilian harm mitigation measures, that we're also constantly going back and making sure that policymakers, decision makers, are acutely aware of the human costs of war. And pushing back, in this case, on what is an increasingly militarized approach to great power competition. Again, even while we push for better protection in the planning process in the event that the worst does come to pass. So in the interest of time, I will leave it there, but really looking forward to learning from the panel in this conversation. Thanks.
Annie, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And we are a little bit pressed for time, but I would just like to really quickly kind of circle back and I thought was really stood out from your presentation is that there are many things that we can observe and learn at the moment. A lot of this thinking is about what might happen in the future, but your to what we have seen occur in the Middle East over recent years, and your statement that is a current pressing problem, which is only going to be exacerbated in something like a near-peer conflict, really cut through. And the fact that an urban environment in particular is just a system of systems, and the effects when you enter into that environment on the health, on water, on food, on displacement, on economic life, on individual trauma, they're wide ranging, not just in the spectrum, but also geographically possibly. So I found that extremely interesting. You did have a question about proportionality, which I thought was very interesting. Butch, I don't know if you would like to speak to that very quickly before we wrap up.
I'd be happy to. I also would be happy to defer to scholarliness before beauty if Mitt has any comments on that first, or I can go forward. Mitt, do you have anything you'd like to offer, and then I'll dovetail?
I'll just say that there's no specific guidance in Article 57 in Additional Protocol 1, but it does talk about when harms are excessive in terms of loss of life, injuries, and damage to civilian objects, or any combination of those. But Butch has, by far the better operational experience on this, so I'd be very interested in hearing from him.
Thanks. Yeah, Annie, I like the question. I think it's totally fair. Traditionally, those analyses have been undertaken on a strike-by-strike basis, which sort of defeats the purpose of looking at cumulative effects. It's very difficult to measure. There is not a doctrinal methodology for looking at cumulative effects. The exception to that might be a campaign of bombing or something like that. So if you had a Tomahawk strike that consisted of 70 or 80 missiles in a single volley or something like that, you would have to assess the effects of that strike, as opposed to looking at 70 different Tomahawk strikes. That you'd be looking at is the effects of the entire volley and the cumulative effects and the complementary effects of the entire volley. Mike just hit the point there. The fact that our own concepts talk about systems of systems recognize that we now recognize, if we didn't recognize before, we're certainly moving towards a recognition that these systems of systems means by definition that things interplay with each other in ways that we had not really considered in a mature fashion when we only approach things from a linear analysis, right? I mean, from a battlefield from the movies. Well, that ain't how it works anymore. Where what my services Pride Achievement of General Krulak talks about the 3-block war, where you could have within 3 blocks 3 different types of conflict that are going on with radically different effects depending on which block of the conflict that you're in. Annie, I take your point about indirect reverberating effects. My position so far has been, well, that's not the law, but Mitt's Mitt's point is exactly right. And that doesn't mean that mere compliance isn't enough, just because necessarily considering, we've never really considered reverberating effects as something we needed to account for when we look at distinction and proportionality. But it's clear that we're moving in that direction when we look at impacts of munitions and strikes on urban environments. We have to look at it systematically as opposed to linearly. It would be irresponsible not to consider that in our planning. So this is, like all things military, it's plodding along. It's slow but sure, but you have the accretion over time. I think we account for context, right? So impacts on an urban area that it consists of dense reinforced concrete structures with concrete roofs is very different than the impact on an urban area that has tin roofs or thatched roofs or something like that. So we have to consider the effects of munitions depending on the context of target areas. And the last thing I wanted to remark on is, Annie, I take your point also about the militarization of great conflict. I was talking to a friend from NASA the other day. NASA. And I said, I'm almost reminiscent of the days when great power competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, everything wasn't a military question, and NASA had a huge role in that great power competition, and with a lower human cost, right? We were able to compete with the Soviets through the space program and through economics in a way that everything didn't become militarized. So I take your point there, and it's kind of funny to reminisce about how things were in the Cold War, but they were stable, and everything about great power competition wasn't a function of comparative military capability. So I know, Mike, we're running out of time there, so I will halt there and see if we have other questions.
I think we've got a little bit of a hard stop, and unfortunately, a mere hour is not enough. I think we could certainly keep going for another hour if we were able to, but I think we probably need to wrap it up now. But we were really just getting started with some of the discussion and swapping of perspectives. So thank you so much to our panel members. I think this has been fascinating for me to be able to sit and moderate this discussion. Thank you very much, of course, to the American Society for International Law, the Liber Society, and the Stockton Center at the U.S. Naval War College. I think we've had a fascinating discussion, a reflection back in order to look forward. I think we have maintained that IHL, of course, remains key, remains relevant and essential, but the accents in some aspects of IHL may be different in the future. I particularly like the idea of a culture of civilian protection filtering its way through military forces. And obviously, one of the things that stood out when we talk about precautions, we talk about reverberating effects, is understanding the environment that we're in order to best protect civilians and mitigate the harm that may occur to them in such operations. Just to conclude, thank you to all of our audience members as well for participating. And I would just like to give a quick plug for next week, which will be the third week of this symposium. That will be on Thursday, the 15th of October, 12 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be civilian casualty response measures, looking at investigations, reports, and reparations. You can register on the ACIL events calendar, and I encourage you to do so. I certainly will. So thank you to everybody, the panel members, the audience, and the American Society for International Law for this fascinating discussion.